disappearance of 7-month-old Emmanuel Haro in Riverside County, California, has shaken the community to its...
We come to you guys asking you to help us find our son. He was abducted last night from Big Five. Sorry, they struck my wife while she was trying to change his diaper. Really, just ask you guys if you can help us, you know? Please. This is what he looks like. He's just a baby. Just give our son back.
When the story first broke, a desperate plea from two young parents outside a sporting goods store in California. Their trembling voices echoed across newsrooms as they begged for help finding their 7-month-old son. At that moment, we believed we were witnessing a heartbreaking case of abduction. A mother struck unconscious in a parking lot, a baby snatched by a stranger, a community bracing for the worst. But as the investigation unfolded, every layer of the narrative began to collapse, revealing something far darker than anyone could have imagined. From the beginning, the official version was simple. Rebecca and Jake Haro claimed their infant son, Emmanuel, had been taken while she was changing his diaper near a Big Five parking lot. Police searched surrounding neighborhoods, and the family gave emotional interviews, pleading for the child's safe return.
Did Jake Haro confess?
We come to you guys asking you to help us find our son.
Jake said in tears.
Sorry, they struck my wife while she was trying to change his diaper.
Yet within days, investigators began to notice contradictions. Surveillance footage didn't align with the couple's timeline. Witnesses recalled no sign of a struggle. The mother's visible bruise, a black eye shown during that first appearance, raised new questions rather than confirming her story. As law enforcement pressed further, inconsistencies became evidence, and sympathy turned into suspicion. According to the Riverside County District Attorney,
the filing in this case reflects our belief that baby Emmanuel was a victim of child over time, and that eventually, because of abuse, he succumbed to those injuries.
Those words marked the collapse of the kidnapping narrative. Both parents were taken to custody and charged with murder and filing a false report. As veteran investigator Phil Waters told,
they're both culpable, they're both going to be responsible, and even they're both parties to the murder of this little baby.
From that point, the case shifted from a missing child alert to a homicide investigation. The search for Emmanuel's body led authorities to the rugged Moreno Valley Badlands, where cadaver dogs, investigators, and even the accused father in custody combed through the terrain.
We have a pretty strong indication of where the remains of baby Emmanuel are, that investigation is ongoing at this time,
said officials at the scene, as the nation watched and waited for closure. What began as a local emergency soon gripped the entire country. The disappearance of a 7-month-old child, and the revelation that both parents were now behind bars, ignited outrage and disbelief nationwide. The public's initial compassion transformed into a collective demand for truth. As headlines shifted from missing infant to parents charged with murder, a wave of anger surged through communities who had once volunteered in the search. Across the United States, people began using the words justice for Emmanuel, a call that symbolized not only grief for one lost life, but a reckoning with the failures of the very systems meant to protect the innocent. The most haunting question lingered: how did this happen again? Years earlier, Jake had been convicted in another case involving harm to a baby, but was released on probation rather than facing long-term imprisonment. That statement resonated beyond the courtroom. The issue was no longer just about one family, but about the justice system's repeated leniency toward those with a history of violence in the home. Each televised segment, from the DA's press conference to the on-scene coverage, became part of a growing national discussion about prevention, accountability, and reform. Even legal commentators who had covered hundreds of similar tragedies expressed disbelief that probationary policies could fail so profoundly. As the days passed and the search continued without a recovery, Emmanuel's name became a symbol, not only for justice delayed, but for trust betrayed. When Vinnie Politan closed one of his broadcasts, his words captured what many Americans felt. That message transformed grief into momentum.
We're here to get justice. We're here to speak for Emmanuel because he wasn't able to speak for himself. So we're here and we have his back and we're ready to go. We're ready to fight. We're going to fight tooth and nail. We're going to get justice for Emmanuel.
The Emmanuel case is now more than an unsolved search. It stands as a reminder that every overlooked risk, every unheeded warning, can end in irreversible loss. And as we follow this investigation to its conclusion, we carry a single, unrelenting conviction: that Emmanuel's story will not be forgotten, and that true justice begins when society refuses to look away again. Setting and main characters. We have traced the story of Emmanuel's father, Jake Haro, back to years before the tragedy that captured the nation's attention. His background reveals a pattern of instability, emotional volatility, and decisions that gradually eroded the trust of those around him. Born and raised in Southern California, Jake lived a life that on the surface seemed ordinary, a working-class father, a man with dreams of stability. Yet beneath that exterior was a temperament marked by impulsivity, control, and an inability to manage conflict within his family circle. In 2018, long before Emmanuel's birth, Jake stood before a California for an incident involving his infant daughter. The child, only 10 weeks old, suffered injuries that permanently changed her life. Jake was convicted under California's penal code for causing severe bodily harm to a minor. Despite the seriousness of the case, the court imposed a suspended sentence, placing him on probation rather than in state custody.
Inflicted on her, and he got a probationary sentence, which is disgusting. It's something that Manuel and I have talked about a lot on this program, and David, I know you agree, he shouldn't have been out. He was out, and he was able to have another son, and look what happened.
That judicial decision, meant to offer rehabilitation, became one of the most heavily criticized aspects of the later Emmanuel case. Following his release, Jake appeared to rebuild his life. He married Rebecca, the mother of Emmanuel, and together they presented the image of a small, hopeful family. But behind the facade of normalcy, there were fractures, unspoken tensions that would later surface in the form of deception and tragedy. When Emmanuel vanished in August 25, Jake's past was immediately revisited by investigators and the media. The 2018 conviction was no longer an isolated event, it became a warning that had been ignored. Those who observed him in court and during televised proceedings described him as alternating between calm detachment and bursts of remorse. Yet, what stood out most was Jake's paradoxical nature, capable of outward composure even while facing unthinkable charges. In every frame, every recorded statement, we sensed a man both aware of his guilt and desperate to maintain control of the narrative. His actions reflected not sudden malice, but a steady descent shaped by denial, impulsivity, and a haunting inability to accept accountability, traits that, left unchecked, culminated in the disappearance of his youngest child. We began to understand Rebecca not through courtroom documents, but through every subtle detail that emerged during the investigation. To the public, she appeared as the young mother who had tearfully claimed she was attacked while tending to her infant, the woman whose trembling plea for help framed the earliest moments of the case. Yet as investigators pieced together the truth, Rebecca's role proved far more complex, defined by silence, contradiction, and a strange duality between victim and participant. Before Emmanuel's disappearance, Rebecca lived a modest life in Riverside County. She was known for her quiet demeanor, her tendency to defer decisions to others, and her apparent devotion to family. When the couple first appeared before cameras, she stood beside Jake, her face partially obscured by a dark mark under one eye. That single image would later become a symbol of everything uncertain about her involvement.
When she was, it was kind of hard to see in that video, but a black eye was visible on her when they were announcing that baby Emmanuel was taken and that she was accosted in this parking lot. There it is. Thank you to our awesome director, Matt Woolley, for popping up that. Okay, so look at that. That doesn't look fresh, right? You know, we discussed this and we're going, that looks like that might have been there before.
As Julie Grant observed, experts analyzing the footage suggested that Rebecca's behavior carried signs of emotional entrapment, what some described as a form of dependency born from fear and manipulation. Private investigator Manuel Gomez described it as a condition of mental confinement.
She's a victim first. She's a victim of domestic violence and a victim of, in my opinion, professionally, is Stockholm Syndrome. This man brainwashed her. She was beaten so much that she, did anything to survive herself and life.
From the moment she repeated the fabricated abduction story to the police, her words seemed rehearsed, as if she were protecting someone rather than searching for her child. In that silence, in those restrained gestures during the press conference, we saw not just complicity, but also captivity. Rebecca became the embodiment of a quiet paradox, a woman trapped between loyalty and truth, her own voice lost beneath the shadow of the man beside her. We remember Emmanuel as the center of this tragedy, a 7-month-old child whose life had barely begun. Born in January 2025, he entered a home already shadowed by tension, a place that carried the remnants of past harm and unhealed history. From his earliest weeks, investigators would later discover that signs of mistreatment had begun as early as 10 weeks old, a revelation that forever altered how we viewed the family's story. When the couple stood before cameras, Emmanuel's photograph, round-cheeked, bright-eyed, innocent, appeared on posters across California. He never spoke a word, yet his silence now carries the weight of an entire case. His absence continues to define every step of the investigation. We traced the family's history beyond the immediate household and found a wider circle of lives shaped by the same orbit. Jake had older children from a previous relationship, one of whom suffered lasting harm years before Emmanuel's birth. His former partner, now living apart from the chaos, had fought for stability and distance, yet the echoes of that earlier case lingered in court files and community memory. Within the current marriage, multiple young children shared the home, forming a fragile network of siblings bound by uncertainty. When the arrests came, relatives on both sides were left to confront an impossible grief, the loss of a child and the collapse of a family. For the extended family, the case was not only a legal matter but a permanent fracture in their shared story. Detailed timeline. We look back to 2018, when the first official record of Jake Haro's violent conduct appeared in California court files. He faced charges after an assault that left his infant daughter gravely injured. The case concluded with a conviction, yet instead of prison time, Jake received a suspended sentence and probation. That decision would later echo through every headline, every press conference, and every courtroom discussion following Emmanuel's disappearance. At the time, the court described him as a man with potential for rehabilitation, believing strict supervision could replace incarceration. But behind that leniency lay a pattern of anger and manipulation that quietly continued in his personal life. His probation period ended without incident on paper, though those who knew him recalled his temper, his need for control, and his tendency to shift blame. When investigators reopened the 2018 record after Emmanuel's case, the pattern became undeniable. The warning signs were instability, impulsiveness, and refusal to accept responsibility. We realized this wasn't an isolated mistake. It was the first step in a sequence that the justice system failed to interrupt. What had once been considered a chance for redemption had instead become the missed intervention that allowed a preventable tragedy to unfold years later. We turn to the events that unfolded in early August 2025, when investigators would later determine Emmanuel's short life came to an end. The timeline began quietly, within the family's home in Riverside County, where the days passed without public notice. Then, between August 5 and 14, everything changed. Detectives now believe those were the crucial days, the period when the infant's condition deteriorated and the final act occurred. The district attorney summarized it with quiet precision, explaining that Emmanuel's injuries reflected a pattern over time, not a single moment of harm. By the time law enforcement was called, the baby was already gone. Inside the home, officers found inconsistencies that contradicted the parents' story. The carefully rehearsed account of an outdoor attack could not explain the physical traces left behind. Witness statements showed no one saw a struggle. The surroundings bore no sign of intrusion. As investigators reconstructed the sequence of days before August 14, they identified a chilling truth: Emmanuel had likely died at home. The silence that followed was not confusion but calculation. The parents' move would shift the narrative from tragedy to deception. What began as a domestic emergency transformed into a public spectacle, one designed to disguise a hidden truth beneath the language of victimhood. And it was that false narrative that would soon dominate the national stage, setting the tone for the next chapter in this devastating story. We watched as the couple stood before cameras, framed by microphones and flashing lights, pleading for help that would never come. The staged performance took place on August 14, outside a local sporting goods store. Rebecca spoke first, her voice trembling as she described a man who had allegedly approached her while she was changing Emmanuel's diaper. Jake stood beside her, holding a printed flyer of their missing child. Those words traveled fast. Local stations repeated the claim for hours, turning their appeal into a statewide search. But behind the images of anguish lay subtle inconsistencies that investigators noticed almost immediately: the absence of witnesses, the mismatch between timestamps, and the way Rebecca avoided eye contact each time the story was retold. In reviewing the footage, analysts later noted how the couple's expressions shifted depending on who was speaking. Jake appeared assertive, pressing the narrative forward, while Rebecca stood silently, nodding, her face shadowed by a fading bruise. For the public, it was a portrait of desperation. For law enforcement, it was the first sign of premeditation. The press conference, intended to mobilize sympathy, instead provided the foundation for criminal charges. What had begun as a plea for help became evidence of deceit. Within days, the story of a kidnapping unraveled, not through confrontation, but through the quiet contradictions that spoke louder than any confession could. We followed the case into its next phase, as the investigation shifted from missing person search to homicide inquiry. By August 22, 2025, detectives had compiled enough evidence to confront both parents. Surveillance footage, phone records, and inconsistencies in their statements painted a picture too deliberate to ignore. The sheriff's department obtained arrest warrants, charging Jake and Rebecca with murder and filing a false police report. When officers arrived at their residence, the scene was calm yet tense. Both were taken into custody without resistance. Behind the press release and the official paperwork was a deeper realization. This case was no longer about finding a missing child, but proving who was responsible for his death. Investigators had begun tracing Jake's earlier record, linking his prior conviction to a pattern of escalating violence within the home. As one official later explained during a televised briefing, the turning point came when forensic teams found evidence inconsistent with the supposed outdoor abduction. Nothing in the car, the parking lot, or the surrounding area matched Rebecca's account. In the DA's words, it was no longer a mystery of disappearance but a crime concealed under layers of fabrication. Following the arrests, prosecutors prepared to present the case before a judge. The charges carried potential life sentences, and the upcoming hearings promised to expose the full extent of deception that had misled the nation. From that day forward, the case ceased to be an open question. It became a trial of accountability, forcing everyone who had once believed the parents' plea to confront the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. We stood alongside investigators as they searched the rugged hills of Moreno Valley on August 24. Dozens of personnel formed a wide grid, moving methodically through dry brush and loose soil. At the center of the operation was Jake himself, escorted in a prison uniform, surrounded by detectives. The sight drew both hope and unease. It was rare for a suspect to be physically present at such a critical stage of a search. Officials confirmed that he had agreed to cooperate, yet his behavior on site puzzled observers. He gestured vaguely, never pointing to a specific location, and appeared detached from the urgency around him. After hours of searching, nothing was found. The sheriff later called the outcome inconclusive. When the teams left the valley, the air felt heavier. Emmanuel's body had not been recovered, and without it, investigators faced an agonizing limitation. They had probable cause, but no closure. The canyon remained silent, holding secrets that only one man could reveal. We later learned of what became known as the jailhouse admission. While in custody, Jake reportedly spoke with an informant during an internal operation. Sources claimed he acknowledged causing Emmanuel's death and placing the child's remains in a trash container. When questioned, officials publicly denied that any formal confession existed. The district attorney called the story misinformation, though multiple journalists reaffirmed their sources. Behind the official statements, investigators continued their quiet pursuit of truth. Whether Jake's words met the legal definition of a confession remained uncertain, but they guided renewed searches and clarified investigative leads. Experts later explained that such statements, even when inadmissible, often hold fragments of truth disguised by self-preservation. In the end, what mattered most was not what Jake said, but what he refused to clarify. He never revealed where Emmanuel's body was. His silence, deliberate and absolute, became the final barrier between fact and peace. For investigators, justice remained incomplete, the case now resting in the uneasy space between knowledge and proof. Crime details and evidence. We examined the grim interval between August 5 and August 14, the span in which investigators believe Emmanuel's life ended. During those 9 days, the atmosphere inside the Haro residence transformed from domestic tension to irreversible tragedy. There were no external witnesses, no signs of forced entry, and no medical records after the first week of August. What unfolded in that silence became the central question of the investigation. Jake's past offered the clearest precedent for what occurred. His earlier conviction for violent conduct toward a child suggested a pattern of outbursts escalating under stress. The same tendencies reappearing the week of Emmanuel's death. Investigators later reconstructed the sequence through evidence in the home, disturbed bedding, blood traces, and the absence of infant supplies that had previously been seen by neighbors. From these findings, they concluded that the cause resulted from repeated physical assault over a sustained period. According to the district attorney's briefing, the injuries were consistent with a progression rather than a single event. That description defined the nature of the crime, not an impulsive act, but a sequence of uncontrolled aggression that intensified over days. The precise timing remains unclear, but forensic analysts narrowed it to the period between August 5 and August 14. Within that window, the child's condition would have deteriorated rapidly. By August 10, neighbors reported unusual quiet around the house. Rebecca's communication with acquaintances ceased entirely. Investigators believe she was aware of the child's worsening state, but paralyzed by fear and dependence, unwilling to seek help. Jake, meanwhile, appeared detached when questioned later, claiming that Emmanuel had fallen ill and that he didn't know what to do. Those statements contrasted sharply with the forensic evidence, which indicated deliberate and sustained harm rather than neglect or accident. The crime reached its culmination in the early hours of August 14. Reconstruction experts determined that a final act of violence occurred in the bedroom, followed by an attempt to conceal the body. The aftermath was marked by frantic activity cleaning, discarding clothing, and preparing a false narrative. Within hours, the couple would appear in public to announce an abduction, transforming the scene of domestic horror into a stage for deception. When detectives later reviewed body cam footage from that day, they noted Jake's composure and Rebecca's exhaustion. The quiet choreography of two people performing remorse while concealing the truth. The timeline, physical evidence, and behavioral analysis all pointed toward one conclusion: Emmanuel's death was neither spontaneous nor accidental. It was the culmination of escalating violence carried out over multiple days, within the walls of a home that had already borne witness to harm years before. We now understand that the crime did not begin on the day Emmanuel disappeared. It began with every unchecked outburst that came before. What ended in the second week of August was not merely a single act of brutality, it was the final consequence of a cycle long ignored, played out in silence until it claimed the most defenseless life of all. We followed the trail of what happened after August 14, when the false report had already been made and the truth was beginning to collapse. Jake's next actions revealed a calculated effort to erase every physical reminder of Emmanuel's existence. Surveillance footage from Beaumont captured a sequence of quiet but deliberate movements, a man disposing of multiple trash bags and later stopping by a donation center. Investigators later confirmed that among the discarded items were baby clothes, toys, and feeding bottles. This process unfolded methodically, not in panic but in a cold routine. Jake loaded the bags into his vehicle, drove east toward the outskirts of Beaumont, and was seen unloading them near a refuse collection point. Hours later, he entered a nearby charity outlet and left behind a box marked with infant items. That moment, preserved on video, would later be described by investigators as an attempt to cleanse the timeline, to eliminate objects that could tie the couple to Emmanuel's final days. We realized then that the effort to conceal did not stop with words. It extended to every trace of a child's presence, each item discarded, each memory erased, a final act of denial committed under the guise of normalcy. We reviewed the physical evidence gathered during the initial phase of the investigation. The first clue emerged from surveillance footage at the Big 5 sporting goods parking lot, where Rebeccawan investigators analyzed the footage frame by frame. There was no sign of a man, no visible struggle, and no witness matching her description. The empty parking space stood as a silent contradiction. Inside the family home, the inspection uncovered irregularities: stripped bedding, disinfectants left open, and a crib untouched for days. Detectives noted that the environment lacked any trace of an infant's daily life. Each discovery contradicted the narrative the couple had repeated in public. The false setting of an abduction collapsed under the weight of its own physical details, turning what had been a story of disappearance into a crime scene that spoke for itself. Claimed she had been attacked by a stranger while changing her baby's diaper. Yet the video told another story entirely. We turned to the digital trail that followed Jake into custody. During his incarceration, investigators conducted what became known as a Perkins operation, an undercover placement intended to prompt candid remarks.
Missing kid. That's what it said. It said missing kid on that flyer. Okay, some interesting reporting in this case, and I want to put this up. This is from Brian Enton. Any of you following true crime know Brian Enton, incredible investigative reporter for News Nation. This is what he reported. Sources have told News Nation's Brian Enton that Jake Haro, the boy's father, spoke to an informant while in jail as part of a Perkins operation. Haro acknowledged he killed baby Emmanuel and then put his body in the trash. Sources also told Enton that Haro initially told investigators he rolled over in bed, causing baby Emmanuel's death, and then he said he buried the body. Sources say that is why Haro was taken from jail to lead investigators to a search area over the weekend.
These alleged admissions provided new direction. His routes, traced through vehicle telemetry, showed late-night travel toward remote terrain near Moreno Valley. Those coordinates aligned with the area where cadaver dogs were later deployed, though the district attorney denied a formal confession.
Listen.
Well, see, that's not true. So I don't know where you, well, no. See, this is what happens when you've got all these folks out there online and these keyboard warriors. You get a lot of misinformation, and what you just said is not true. It's misinformation. So that's what I'll tell you did not happen.
The information extracted during the operation shaped the search strategy and timeline. Each route, each message recovered from his phone, outlined a sequence of movement that contradicted the image of helplessness he later tried to portray. We examined what the parents said after their arrest. When the cameras were gone and only recorders remained, Jake spoke to a reporter from jail and continued to deny wrongdoing. "Rebecca is innocent," Haro said. "The media is killing her. She is a beautiful woman, she loves her children." Plea: Rebecca is innocent, Haro said. He would never hurt a baby. Rebecca, interviewed separately, repeated her own appeal. "I will not give up. I will not give up on my baby," Haro said in an August 24 jailhouse interview with the Southern News Group reporter, during which she maintained that Emmanuel was kidnapped. CO 64 Yo 1620. Those words, stripped of context, revealed two intertwined motives: his insistence on control and her unbroken loyalty. Detectives saw not clarity but choreography, two statements orbiting the same falsehood, each reinforcing the other. Behind Jake's calm denial and Rebecca's trembling defense lay a shared performance built to sustain illusion. The transcripts of these conversations became as revealing as physical evidence. Every phrase, every repetition, exposed the couple's attempt to preserve a crumbling story long after the facts had already betrayed them. We could not overlook that appeared on Rebecca's face during the first press appearance. Julie Grant described it plainly. Investigators questioned whether it aligned with the supposed parking lot assault or reflected something far closer to home. The discoloration, older than her story suggested, became a quiet piece of evidence, one that spoke not of an abduction but of submission, the visible trace of fear hidden beneath practiced composure. Expert analysis. The analyses given by experts who dissected the Haro case across multiple broadcasts, each bringing a distinct perspective shaped by professional experience. Their insights, though varied in approach, converged on a shared conclusion: that this tragedy was no accident, and the evidence of deceit was overwhelming. Private investigator Erica Morris viewed the case through the lens of behavioral patterns and motive. Vinnie Politan, she stated.
So he has zero credibility with me already as a but second, Vinny, I don't believe a word this man is saying. He is wasting their time. He's doing it intentional.
Morris emphasized that Jake was the dominant actor, while Rebecca, though complicit, acted under psychological confinement. Her conclusion was clear: Jake was the primary offender, Rebecca remained hidden behind dependence and fear. Former homicide detective Phil Waters analyzed the same evidence from a procedural standpoint, focusing on culpability. Waters dismissed theories of one parent being less involved, asserting that their mirrored defenses demonstrated coordination rather than contradiction. Former FBI Special Agent Bobby Chacon extended the analysis to the physical search, arguing that the father's field participation suggested deception.
It tells me that he didn't know exactly where, but he was working on information that may have been told to him. Who told him that? That's up to speculation, but I'm speculating that he did not know exactly where, but he said this is where they, whoever that was, told me they had put them.
During coverage, he explained Chacon believed the remains were likely discarded near landfill zones, and that Jake's cooperation was strategic rather than sincere. Retired NYPD officer Manuel Gomez offered a practical search perspective. From his field experience, he proposed two possibilities.
Case one, the baby could possibly be at the landfill that was near, not far from his home, because there was indications of him going to two different locations, dropping off bags in a dumpster. That's one location. But the second one was where he bought the baby, where he bought the cops, which was in that canyon area off the highway.
His assessment underscored the bleak odds of recovery due to environmental conditions and scavenging animals. Former prosecutor David Bruno analyzed Jake's eventual plea, highlighting its rarity. Bruno noted that bypassing negotiation showed legal inevitability, evidence too strong for contest. Finally, Lisa Black, a crime scene investigator, focused on search logistics. Discussing recovery efforts.
Baby, then cadaver dogs are probably going to be your best friends.
Her pragmatic stance framed the final stage of investigation, the pursuit of Emmanuel's remains, where truth now rests in evidence, terrain, and time. Erica Morris takes the discussion beyond emotion and into strategy. Her role as a private investigator specializing in high-profile missing cases allowed her to read patterns others might overlook. When Vinnie asked who might bear more responsibility, she paused, then replied with certainty.
Responsible for the other for the abuse? Probably. Because Dad already has a criminal history of abuse. Dad has already taken charges and received a conviction, even though he didn't serve time in prison, which is why Emmanuel is missing and presumed deceased at this point.
She drew a sharp moral distinction between guilt and silence, arguing that Rebecca's lies were tactical rather than impulsive.
She is the one that wasted resources and valuable time in locating a possible living, breathing Emmanuel.
Morris's commentary revealed not only how investigators viewed the pair, but how intent can be hidden beneath performance. Her closing line stayed with us.
If this couple did not want to be parents, then they had options, and that baby could be alive right now.
We turned next to the seasoned voice of Phil Waters, a former homicide detective who had spent more than 20 years working high-profile cases. His experience cut through speculation. When asked to interpret the parents' jailhouse claims of innocence, his conclusion was immediate.
They're just furthering the false narrative here. They don't really have, I'm sure in their minds.
Waters refused to assign greater blame to one over the other, explaining that both had crossed the same moral line together.
Yes, that's the short answer. Yes, they're both culpable. They're both going to be responsible. And even they're both parties to the murder of this little baby.
He also anticipated the next legal step, noting that investigators might later pressure one to turn on the other, but doubted such a split would come easily. To him, the unity of their defense was the most revealing clue. It wasn't loyalty born of love, but complicity born of shared guilt. We listened as retired FBI agent Bobby Chicone, known for his field experience in search and recovery, offered a different vantage point. Chicone described the suspect's behavior as inconsistent with someone telling the truth. Rather than guiding investigators, Jake lingered near the road, avoiding active participation. He added a personal detail that grounded the moment in time.
I drove by that place 12 hours before this, in that area. There was no fire, there was no brush fire, there was no accident. They were there to protect that area the night before.
From this, he inferred coordination, that authorities had already secured the scene in anticipation of Jake's escorted visit. His closing thought summarized his skepticism: cooperation without honesty is just performance. The analysis given by retired NYPD Detective Manuel Gomez, who examined the possibilities of where Emmanuel's remains could be. His dual-scenario explanation drew from experience in large-scale searches. Gomez's insight focused not on guilt, but on recovery, emphasizing how the geography and timing limited chances of discovery. He noted that multiple agencies would need to synchronize efforts if any remains were to be located. His remarks also hinted at the moral weight investigators carried. Finding Emmanuel was not just evidence collection, it was closure. Gomez's grounded tone reminded us that beyond speculation lay logistics, hours of fieldwork, mapping grids, and chasing coordinates under the California heat, searching for what might already be gone. Prosecutor David Bruno dissects the legal meaning behind Jake's unexpected guilty plea. On opening statements, he explained the rarity of such a move. It's extremely rare to plead guilty without a deal, especially this early. It tells me the evidence is overwhelming, and the defense has no strategy left. Bruno highlighted that by waiving negotiation, Jake effectively admitted defeat before trial. The prosecution, he said, would still need to outline motive and timeline, but the plea simplified the path to sentencing. His tone was clinical, but the implication was profound. A man who once maintained innocence had now conceded in silence. Bruno concluded that the case's strength came not from a single confession, but from accumulation, digital footprints, witness contradictions, and physical traces converging into proof that could not be ignored. Crime scene investigator Lisa Black's observations on the recovery efforts in Moreno Valley. Her expertise lay in search methodology, and she grounded the discussion in realism.
Well, I don't think it's that odd that he was there. As the searches I've seen with suspects, you usually have the suspect right there with you, because if you do find something, I imagine investigators want to confront them right away. And it's a big area, so it's really handy if you're hoping he's going to be telling you the truth, that he could be right there on scene saying, no, it wasn't that hill, it was the hill just beyond it, or something like that.
Black's insight reframed Jake's presence, not as cooperation, but as logistical necessity. Later, she discussed what recovery might look like under environmental strain.
Yes, between the heat, it could have already be largely down to a skeleton with the different, you are talking about a very small child, not a full-grown person. So animals could scatter it. On the other hand, if it's wrapped up in a blanket or a sheet or even a plastic bag, if it's buried, then it may remain somewhat intact.
Her tone was analytical but human, acknowledging the urgency investigators faced. In her view, cadaver dogs and timing were decisive. The case hinged not on confession, but on whether science and persistence could still retrieve what time had tried to erase. Riverside County District Attorney Mike Hestron, whose brief public statements defined the prosecution's foundation. He emphasized the difficulty of charging both parents equally while acknowledging the absence of recovered remains.
We filed murder charges on both of them and making a false police report on both of them. So you can extrapolate that we believe that both of them are guilty, that we can prove it's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt for both the murder and the filing of the false.
His words underscored the state's resolve: justice must proceed even without a body. Legal process. The formal charges were filed in Riverside County, where the district attorney's office consolidated the case against Jake and Rebecca under California's most serious statutes. The indictment cited Penal Code 187, murder with malice aforethought, as the primary count. It was supported by Penal Code 273 for endangering the life of a minor, and an additional count for filing a false police report after the staged abduction claim. The document outlined how investigators connected the sequence of deception, the fabricated story, the disposal of evidence, and the coordinated attempt to mislead law enforcement. Each charge carried its own weight within California's legal framework, but together they formed an unbroken narrative of intent and concealment. The murder count reflected Emmanuel's death through violent means. The secondary statute reflected the sustained pattern of mistreatment leading to that outcome. The false report count, though procedural, underscored premeditation, an attempt to create a parallel story to obscure reality. When prosecutors read the indictment before the bench, it was not speculation but structure, a timeline written in law, translating a child's silent suffering into legal accountability that could no longer be denied. The process through the California judicial system, where the distinction between plea and negotiation defines the path toward sentencing. In this case, Jake entered a plea directly to the court, bypassing any arrangement or leniency from the district attorney. The absence of a negotiated deal meant he accepted the charges in full, leaving the determination of punishment to the judge's discretion. Under California law, such a plea is considered a straight plea, in which the defendant acknowledges guilt without conditions. The prosecution still presents its evidence for the record, ensuring the court retains factual foundation for the ruling. The defense, represented by a public defender, may address mitigating factors, but without a prearranged term, the outcome remains entirely in the judge's hands. This procedure reflected both resignation and strategy. By admitting guilt early, Jake avoided a prolonged trial that could have deepened public outrage. Yet his silence also left Rebecca isolated, her case now proceeding independently, without the leverage of joint defense. In the California system, such separations often signal divergence, one defendant submitting to certainty, the other still navigating the long corridors of procedural uncertainty. We examined the projected sentencing outcomes based on statutory guidelines and prosecutorial statements. For Jake, the Penal Code 187 conviction carried a mandatory minimum of 25 years to life in state prison. Given the absence of plea negotiation and the aggravating circumstances of a child's death, the sentencing recommendation was expected to align with the maximum range. The judge retained authority to impose additional terms related to the false report and obstruction charges, though these would likely merge under the principal count. Rebecca's fate remained less defined. Her level of cooperation and the degree of her involvement would heavily influence the outcome. If she provided truthful testimony consistent with investigative findings, prosecutors were prepared to recommend a reduced charge under Penal Code 273, with an expected sentence exceeding 15 years. However, continued denial or obstruction could result in full exposure to the same murder charge, aligning her penalty more closely with Jake's. The expected disparity between the two sentences was not about fairness but responsibility. One shaped by direct action, the other by submission and silence. Both faced the same courtroom, but the law would weigh intent and choice differently when judgment arrived. We observed the case move into the courtroom of Judge Gary Polk, a veteran jurist known for measured rulings in high-profile homicide trials. His courtroom demeanor was steady, deliberate, and guided by procedure rather than spectacle. Presiding over both defendants' hearings, he made clear that the matter would proceed on evidence, not emotion. The defense was led by a public defender, appointed after the couple's financial disclosure showed limited assets following their arrest. The defense strategy for Jake was minimal, constrained by his voluntary plea. The attorney's primary role was to ensure due process and to confirm that his client's admission met constitutional standards of understanding and voluntariness. For Rebecca, however, the defense remained active, exploring psychological evaluations, dependency factors, and claims of coercion. Judge Polk emphasized transparency at each stage, reminding both counsel that procedural integrity would outweigh public scrutiny. Within the restrained walls of his courtroom, the spectacle that once dominated national headlines faded into methodical judicial rhythm. Each hearing unfolded without interruption, a contrast to the chaos that began it, evidence catalogued, testimony structured, and the pursuit of closure narrowed to legal precision. We followed the final procedural calendar as it was released by the court clerk's office. October 28 was scheduled for Rebecca's preliminary hearing, where the prosecution would present evidence sufficient to bind her case over for trial. Witnesses were expected to include the lead detective, the medical examiner, and digital analysts summarizing the timeline. The hearing would determine whether the case would proceed under full murder charges or be reduced to a lesser count reflecting complicity. Meanwhile, Jake's sentencing hearing was set for November 3. Having entered his plea earlier in October, his appearance before Judge Polk would mark the conclusion of his prosecution. The district attorney's office confirmed that the recommended term would fall within the statutory life sentence range, citing aggravating factors related to deceit and concealment. These dates carried both finality and uncertainty, one chapter closing as another remained open. For investigators, the approaching hearings represented validation of years of evidence gathering. For the court, they represented the point where moral outrage translated into formal judgment. By early November, the timeline that began with a missing child alert would reach its final legal reckoning, not through discovery, but through the slow, deliberate weight of justice. The synthesis of expert commentary, as both a comparative and interpretive exercise, a way to uncover how distinct professional perspectives converge on the same event. Each specialist operated within their own discipline, yet all viewed the Haro case through a lens of responsibility, motive, and concealment. Across their analyses, a pattern emerged, a layered sequence of violence, denial, and procedural precision that exposed not just a crime, but a collapse of conscience within a domestic sphere. I began with the interpretive lens of Erica Morris, whose investigative approach centered on psychological mapping rather than evidence alone. In her view, the Haro case was a dual narrative, one active, one passive. Jake represented direct aggression, while Rebecca embodied concealment. Morris's analysis positioned them as two halves of a single intention, the first acting, the second enabling. Her reasoning was based on behavioral continuity. Jake's earlier conviction, she noted, established a predictive cycle rather than an isolated act. To Morris, patterns of physical domination often escalate when met with silence or emotional dependence. Rebecca's participation, therefore, wasn't accidental. It was the culmination of psychological conditioning reinforced through fear and loyalty. What made her interpretation compelling was its ethical duality. She didn't absolve Rebecca, but she reframed her actions within a psychological survival model. The abduction story, Morris suggested, wasn't born from creativity but from necessity, a diversion crafted under coercion. For her, moral culpability existed on a spectrum. Jake's choices shaped destruction, Rebecca's silence prolonged it. Her analysis gave structure to the emotional chaos surrounding the case. Beneath every procedural milestone, the arrest, the plea, the sentencing, she found the quiet logic of dependency, that fear, when normalized, becomes complicity. Where Morris examined psychology, Phil Waters examined behavior. His background in homicide investigations gave him fluency in deceit, the kind spoken not in words but in coordination. Waters' approach was simple but devastating. He saw no distinction between the two defendants. In his reconstruction, both parents operated under a unified lie. Their mirrored statements, their synchronized public pleas, and their identical denials revealed, in his view, a choreography of guilt. When one partner reinforces the other's narrative without hesitation, he said it isn't love, it's strategy. Waters' scramwork was grounded in logic rather than emotion. He viewed the press conference, the staged appeal, and the courtroom silence as successive layers of defense, not against public judgment, but against internal collapse. To him, such unity under pressure indicates premeditated agreement. Yet Waters also recognized a tactical divide between prosecution and psychology. Investigators could charge both equally, but he understood that emotional roles within domestic crimes often blur the boundary between action and acquiescence. In his experience, once both suspects are charged, one usually fractures under pressure, but here, both maintained the lie. That endurance, he concluded, was as telling as any confession. Waters' analysis reminded us that guilt isn't only proven through confession, sometimes it's proven through synchronization. We then turned to Bobby Chicone, whose expertise lay in fieldwork and forensic logistics. Unlike the others, his analysis focused on what could be seen, geography, procedure, and motion. His reconstruction of the Moreno Valley search reframed cooperation as theater. Chicone saw Jake's participation in the search not as remorse but as a performance calibrated for optics. His observation that law enforcement had secured the site the night before revealed procedural foresight. Investigators likely anticipated misinformation and controlled access accordingly. Yet, Jake's posture during the search, his lack of direction, hesitation, and distance from active zones, suggested that he had no genuine memory of the disposal site. From Chacon's perspective, lies reveal themselves spatially. People who remember act with conviction, those who fabricate hesitate. Jake's behavior, he reasoned, mirrored the latter. His cooperation was partial, performative, a manipulation of procedure to simulate transparency. In Chacon's world, facts exist in landscapes. The absence of orientation, the unresponsiveness to terrain, the refusal to guide, all of these became their own evidence. He believed the search was not failure but exposure, proof that the man claiming to cooperate never truly intended to help recover the truth. Manuel Gomez approached the case through the prism of operational probability. Having spent decades in the NYPD analyzing missing persons and violent fatalities, he viewed geography as a behavioral signature. To him, disposal sites always carry a trace of familiarity. They exist within an offender's comfort radius. His analysis outlined two potential recovery zones, the local landfill and a canyon accessible by highway. The landfill represented impulsivity, a location chosen for immediacy and concealment. The canyon represented sentimentality, an attempt to assign symbolic meaning to the act. Gomez explained that the dual possibility reflected internal conflict, practicality versus emotion, both equally destructive. He further reasoned that Rebecca's role as communicator, the one who relayed false details, served to extend the radius of confusion. Every hour redirected toward the wrong location increased the probability of permanent loss. Gomez's voice carried an investigator's pragmatism but a human's sorrow. He admitted the odds of recovery were diminishing with each passing day, citing environmental degradation, heat exposure, and wildlife. Yet even as he acknowledged the bleakness, his language carried the weight of duty, that investigators continue to search, not for closure alone, but for truth in its most tangible form. His analysis grounded theory in terrain, the notion that justice, at times, must first traverse geography before it can reach a courtroom. David Bruno's lens was the law itself, methodical, unyielding, and procedural. Where others saw emotion, he saw motion within the system, pleas, filings, and sentencing matrices. His evaluation of Jake's no-deal plea was a masterclass in legal reading. In California's criminal framework, guilty pleas without negotiation are rare. Bruno recognized this as a structural anomaly, a signal that the defense was cornered by overwhelming evidence. To him, Jake's plea was not an act of contrition but an acceptance of inevitability. It eliminated trial risk but preserved silence. He emphasized such a move stripped the defense of leverage, while simplifying the prosecution's task. It confirmed guilt without revealing detail, leaving unanswered questions intact. Bruno observed that the prosecution's decision to allow this plea, rather than insist on a full trial, suggested strategic restraint, a recognition that closure might serve the public better than confrontation. Bruno's insight lay in the intersection of law and psychology. He noted that while legal guilt was now established, moral understanding remained unresolved. The court could punish, but it could not compel the truth. Jake's plea, he concluded, wasn't an end. It was a procedural surrender that froze the narrative in ambiguity. Lisa Black's expertise represented the scientific boundary of the investigation, the point where fact meets decay. Her analysis approached the case as a logistical puzzle constrained by time, temperature, and environment. She emphasized that recovery success diminishes exponentially with each passing day in open terrain. In Southern California's climate, decomposition progresses rapidly, often reducing remains to skeletal form within weeks. Black highlighted how environmental conditions, heat, soil density, and animal activity interact to scatter evidence, making detection by sight nearly impossible. Her emphasis on cadaver dogs underscored the procedural precision required to counter nature's timeline. Trained dogs, she explained, serve as the final bridge between investigation and recovery when technology fails. Their success, however, depends on accurate coordinates, and here, misinformation had already corrupted the search parameters. Black viewed the August 24 search not as a failure but as a necessary calibration. Each unfruitful effort, she argued, refines the next. Forensic recovery is iterative, a process of exclusion as much as discovery. Her analysis shifted the discussion from guilt to preservation. The challenge now, she said, wasn't just finding evidence but ensuring that what remained could still testify. In her eyes, science was the quiet witness that time could not silence, provided investigators kept looking. The final analytical voice, District Attorney Mike Hestron, embodied the institutional culmination of every other perspective. His framing of the case was clinical yet resolute: 2 defendants, 1 outcome, and a system that would move forward even without physical proof. Hestron's statements revealed confidence in the cumulative weight of the evidence, testimony, timelines, digital traces, and behavioral contradictions. His belief that both parents bore responsibility, regardless of motive, reflected the state's shift toward collective culpability in crimes involving minors. From a prosecutorial standpoint, His focus was on the isthmus of legal truth, not moral reconciliation. Where investigators sought a body, he sought a verdict. His consistency in public briefings demonstrated a strategic message discipline. The law would not yield to speculation or online hysteria. Hestron's position completed the analytical chain, from field to courtroom, from doubt to declaration. In his words, justice was both destination and process, achieved through structure rather than sentiment. When I aligned these analyses in parallel, a coherent structure of interpretation emerged, not a repetition of facts, but an ecosystem of perspectives converging on a single moral gravity. Morris examined the case through dependency and deceit, a study in emotional captivity. Waters interpreted behavior through synchronization, a mirror of complicity. Chicone translated cooperation into performance, the illusion of transparency. Gomez mapped geography to psychology, the terrain of guilt. Bruno rendered confession into legal calculus, guilt without revelation. Black transformed decay into data, a science of persistence. Hestron closed the loop, law as the final arbiter of truth. Each perspective revealed one layer of the same architecture. Intent concealed within coordination, deception masquerading as defense, and silence functioning as both shield and sentence. What unified them was the acknowledgement that this case defied singular interpretation. It was at once procedural, psychological, and existential, a study in how guilt can be both confessed and obscured, admitted yet incomplete. In the end, the experts collectively reconstructed not merely a timeline but a portrait of deterioration, of relationships, morality, and evidence. Their combined insights reminded us that justice in such cases is rarely absolute. It is pieced together, one admission, one observation, one failed search at a time, until the silence left behind finally forms a complete sentence. The search for baby Emmanuel's body remains the most fragile and uncertain phase of the entire investigation. Unlike the courtroom, where guilt can be proven through records and testimony, recovery requires the cooperation of nature, time, and human honesty, three elements rarely aligned. Despite multiple searches and public speculation, the core difficulty lies in the precise geography and environmental decay that followed months of delay. We identified two primary areas of interest emerging from investigative patterns and expert inference: the Beaumont landfill and the canyon corridor along Highway 60. Each carries distinct behavioral and logistical implications. The landfill represents immediacy, a place chosen for speed, convenience, and finality. It aligns with behavioral tendencies observed in individuals seeking to erase physical evidence quickly, especially under panic. Waste disposal routes from the family's residential area connected directly to Beaumont's transfer system, suggesting that even a small disposal action could have passed unnoticed through routine processing. The canyon, by contrast, symbolizes deliberation. It sits off a long stretch of Highway 60, accessible by a single unmonitored entry point. Its terrain, uneven, covered with brush, and sparsely trafficked, allows temporary concealment without tools or preparation. Investigators have long understood that such sites lack symbolic intent, the intersection between guilt and control, where offenders often attempt to reclaim agency through the act of concealment. Both locations mirror different emotional states, one impulsive, one reflective, but converge in their outcome: silence and disappearance amid open, indifferent land. The coordinated search on August 24 marked a critical juncture in the case, not merely because Jake participated, but because his participation redefined investigative protocol. Authorities escorted him from custody to the Moreno Valley area, transforming the event into both a logistical operation and a psychological test. The imagery of that day, uniformed officers walking the hillside, Jake standing near the road, became emblematic of calculated cooperation. He did not lead, he observed. His proximity to the scene without reflected the paradox investigators faced: a defendant willing to appear compliant while withholding substance. Operationally, the search integrated both ground teams and canine units, covering the terrain adjacent to the 60 freeway. However, without direct, verifiable coordinates, every step was an act of approximation. What appeared on video as structured movement was, in reality, a spatial translation of uncertainty. Jake's behavior that day remains one of the most studied aspects of the investigation. His reluctance to direct officers, his limited body language, and his insistence on general rather than specific memory all reinforced a prevailing theory: that the search was not a revelation but a performance. Cooperation, in this instance, became another form of control. The environmental challenges surrounding this case form an almost insurmountable barrier to recovery. The region's high desert climate transforms within days. Temperatures exceeding 100°F accelerate organic decay, reducing the detection window dramatically. 2 months after disposal, even trained forensic units face a drastically altered landscape. Wildlife adds another layer of complexity: coyotes, feral dogs, and smaller scavengers naturally disturb shallow ground layers or unsealed surfaces, scattering remains across wide radii. Investigators must therefore consider not only a single burial point, but a potential dispersal field extending hundreds of meters. Beyond environmental degradation lies the human factor, contamination through time and interference. Unauthorized searchers, drawn by media coverage, may have inadvertently altered ground conditions or removed surface indicators before official recovery teams arrived. Each disturbance, however minor, reshapes scent profiles and visual cues. By late September, any identifiable biological trace would have already been compromised. Investigators now depend on microtraces, fragments of clothing, synthetic fibers, or chemical residues to narrow viable zones. Science, in this stage, must replace visibility with inference. What began as a search for remains evolved into a search for residual truth, buried beneath months of heat and neglect. After evaluating terrain, climate, and behavioral data, the probability of successful recovery rests near 20%, a cautious optimism tempered by realism. The percentage reflects not forensic limitation but the absence of full disclosure from Jake. Without precise geographic markers or honest recounting of events, every search remains blind, guided by fragments of speculation rather than verifiable memory. The landfill scenario, while statistically least recoverable, still offers a procedural path through landfill cell mapping and layered excavation. Yet each new waste cycle buries previous deposits deeper under compacted tonnage, making detection exponentially harder. The canyon, by contrast, remains accessible but topographically deceptive. Each ridge and dry wash mimics concealment. Success therefore depends on one variable: truthful cooperation. Should Jake disclose an exact location, down to the visual landmarks remembered from that night, cadaver units could still detect residual scent and bone fragments despite environmental erosion. But silence has its own endurance. Without confession, probability collapses under entropy. Investigators continue their work knowing that every day without discovery narrows the bridge between evidence and memory. The search has become both literal and symbolic, a pursuit of a child's remains, and of the last possible trace of human honesty within this case. The legal dimension of the Haro case exposes the intersection between moral culpability and procedural order, where the tragedy of a child's death transforms into a structured pursuit of justice. Every motion, filing, and plea represents both closure and confrontation. What began as an emotional narrative of deception and disappearance has now evolved into a meticulous application of California's penal and evidentiary frameworks. We begin with the indictment, the formal declaration of the state's position, a written acknowledgement that evidence, motive, and intent are sufficient to charge. The prosecution filed 3 central counts: Penal Code 187 for murder with malice aforethought, Penal Code 273 for endangering a child, and 1 count of filing a false report to law enforcement. Each statute carries both symbolic and structural weight. Section 187 Reprifornia's most severe classification of homicide, asserting that Emmanuel's death was neither accidental nor circumstantial. It implies intent, or at minimum, conscious disregard for life. Section 273, often paired with homicide charges, anchors the broader pattern of neglect and mistreatment that investigators reconstructed through testimony, timelines, and digital evidence. Finally, the false report charge captures the deliberate fabrication of an abduction, the false narrative that diverted investigative resources, muscled the public, and obscured truth during the most critical early hours. The combined indictment communicates a layered crime. Murder defines the act. Endangerment establishes continuity, falsification demonstrates consciousness of guilt. When read aloud before the court, the document formed both accusation and summation, a synthesis of what the state believes happened, why it matters, and how it will be prosecuted. The indictment thus served not as a beginning but as a declaration. The state was no longer searching for a missing child, but prosecuting a preventable death. California's criminal justice system allows for 2 distinct paths toward resolution: a negotiated plea agreement or a direct plea to the court. Jake's decision to enter a straight plea, admitting guilt without any agreement from the district attorney, represents a rare procedural choice, signaling complete forfeiture of bargaining rights. Under normal circumstances, plea negotiations balance judicial efficiency with fairness, offering defendants a reduced sentence in exchange for acceptance of responsibility. In Jake's case, however, the absence of negotiation reflected both the strength of the evidence and the defendant's isolation. By entering his plea directly to the bench, Jake bypassed prosecutorial discretion, transferring full authority over sentencing to the judge. The process unfolded with procedural precision. The judge confirmed Jake's competency, ensuring that his plea was knowing, intelligent, and voluntary. Once accepted, the plea converted into a conviction, closing the evidentiary phase. No trial followed, no witnesses were cross-examined, and no public airing of forensic details occurred. This procedural decision effectively reshaped the dynamics of justice. It offered closure to the court, but denied the public a narrative resolution. The confession existed only as a legal act, not a factual explanation. For the system, efficiency prevailed. For the community, questions remained unanswered. California law, in this sense, achieved justice by statute but not necessarily by story. The sentencing structure reflects California's bifurcated approach to punishment and rehabilitation. For Jake, the conviction under Penal Code 187 carries a statutory term of 25 years to life in state prison. Given aggravating factors, including the age of the victim, the concealment of the crime, and the prior record of violence, the prosecution has recommended the maximum range. In practical terms, Jake will remain eligible for parole only after 25 calendar years, but historical data suggests that parole for such offenses is rarely granted before 35 to 40 years. For Rebecca, the path diverges. Her level of cooperation, both during and after investigation, determines the eventual charge classification. Prosecutors may reduce her exposure to a secondary count under Penal Code 273, acknowledging her participation as indirect rather than principal. Should the court accept this reclassification, her sentencing range would likely exceed 15 years, encompassing both custodial time and supervised release. This dual framework embodies California's emphasis on proportional culpability, punishing primary actors more severely while allowing secondary participants limited mitigation. Yet the philosophical tension remains. Rebecca's deception prolonged the search, delaying recovery and deepening public mistrust. For the court, her punishment must balance sympathy with accountability. For Jake, the equation is simpler: intent equals permanence. Both outcomes converge under one principle: the state's determination to ensure that Emmanuel's death, though irretrievable, results in institutional consequence. Presiding over the case is Judge Gary Polk, whose reputation for composure and procedural fairness has characterized numerous high-profile homicide trials. His judicial demeanor reflects a commitment to balance, applying the letter of the law without yielding to emotional persuasion. Under his supervision, the Haro proceedings have unfolded with quiet precision, insulated from public spectacle. Jake and Rebecca are represented by public defenders, appointed after a financial review confirmed that both defendants lacked sufficient means for private counsel. The appointment ensured compliance with California's constitutional guarantee of legal representation under the Sixth Amendment. For Jake's defense, the role of the attorney shifted once the plea was entered. The counsel's duty transitioned from argumentation to protection, ensuring procedural correctness, verifying voluntariness, and safeguarding post-conviction rights. Rebecca's defense, however, remains dynamic. Her attorney's focus lies in psychological evaluation, character assessment, and potential negotiation for a reduced charge based on coercion or diminished control. Judge Polk's oversight of these parallel tracks urges emphasis on separation. Though their cases stem from the same tragedy, he insists on treating them as distinct legal narratives. His courtroom functions less as a theater of guilt and more as a laboratory of law, where procedural clarity must prevail even when moral clarity falters. Through Polk's direction, the Haro case demonstrates how judicial structure converts chaos into order, transforming emotional upheaval into measurable consequence. The judicial calendar now delineates two pivotal dates. On October 28, the court convened Rebecca's preliminary hearing, during which the prosecution must establish sufficient cause to bind her over for trial. Preliminary hearings in California function as evidentiary screenings, compact proceedings where investigators summarize findings, introduce material exhibits, and allow limited cross-examination. While not a full trial, the outcome determines the trajectory of her defense. Should probable cause be confirmed, her case advances to the Superior Court for formal arraignment. Meanwhile, Jake's sentencing hearing is scheduled for November 3, marking the final chapter of his criminal process. During this hearing, the prosecution will outline aggravating factors, including deception, prior offenses, and the vulnerability of the victim. The defense may offer mitigating statements, remorse, psychological instability, or familial context, though none can reverse the mandatory sentencing framework. These dates carry symbolic symmetry, one closing, one continuing. Jake's sentence will crystallize the state's punitive stance, while Rebecca's hearing will determine whether she faces the same weight of law or receives conditional leniency. Both proceedings occur before Judge Polk, whose rulings will define the case's legacy within California's broader judicial record. The court's procedural rhythm now mirrors the story's emotional structure, one side resolved through admission, the other through evaluation. Justice, in this sense, proceeds not as drama but as scheduled, precise, incremental, and inexorable. Beyond the courtroom, the Haro case illuminates deeper truths about California's judicial machinery. It showcases how structured legal frameworks must navigate moral chaos, ensuring fairness even when emotion demands retribution. Jake's straight plea demonstrates both the system's efficiency and its silence, justice achieved without narrative closure. Rebecca's still pending case highlights another tension: how law interprets complicity within psychological dependence. This dual progression reveals the adaptability of California's penal structure. The state balances punitive clarity with procedural caution, allowing judges to weigh cooperation and control as separate axes of culpability. The absence of a plea bargain, the reliance on judicial sentencing, and the emphasis on proportional punishment reflect a maturing approach to complex domestic homicides, one where context does not excuse, but informs. Moreover, the case reaffirms the significance of judicial restraint in high-profile prosecutions. By maintaining procedural transparency and preventing external interference, Judge Polk exemplifies how courts safeguard legitimacy amid media scrutiny. Finally, the Haro proceedings underline a larger theme within California's justice narrative: the system's commitment to protect victims, even when recovery is impossible. Emmanuel's absence becomes both evidence and motive, his silence the foundation for every legal action that follows. Through law, the state asserts that even when the body cannot be found, accountability can. In the end, the Haro case stands as a study in legal symmetry, crime answered by structure, deception countered by process, silence replaced with judgment. Every motion, from indictment to sentencing, reaffirms the state's role as both witness and arbiter. The system cannot undo loss, but it can codify consequence. Through the steady precision of California procedure, a tragedy that began in chaos now finds order under law, not through confession alone, but through the deliberate architecture of justice that ensures no act, however hidden, escapes record.